Anne went down to the old graveyard, along a deep rutted lane between high mossy stone dikes tasseled with frosted ferns. Slim pointed Lombardies, from which November winds had not yet stripped all the leaves, grew along it at intervals, coming out darkly against the amethyst of the far hills. But the old graveyard, with half its tombstones leaning at a drunken slant, was surrounded by a 4 square row of tall, somber fir trees. Anne had not expected to find anyone there, and was a little taken aback when she met Miss Valentine Cordelow. With her long, delicate nose, her thin, delicate mouth, her sloping, delicate shoulders, and her general air of invincible ladylikeness, just inside the gate. She knew Miss Valentine, of course, as did everyone in Summerside. She was the local dressmaker, and what she didn't know about people, living or dead, was not worth taking into account. Anne had wanted to wander about by herself, read the odd old epitaphs, and puzzle out the names of forgotten lovers under the lichens that were growing over them. But she could not escape when Miss Valentine slipped an arm through hers and proceeded to do the honors of the graveyard, where there were evidently as many Cordelows buried as Pringles. Miss Valentine had not a drop of Pringle blood in her, and one of Anne's favorite pupils was her nephew. So it was no great mental strain to be nice to her, except that one must be very careful never to hint that she sewed for a living. Miss Valentine was said to be very sensitive on that point. "I'm glad I happened to be here this evening," said Miss Valentine. "I can tell you all about everybody buried here. I always say you have to know the ins and outs of the corpses to find a graveyard really enjoyable. I like a walk here better than in the new. It's only the old families that are buried here, but every Tom, Dick, and Harry is being buried in the new. The Cordelows are buried in this corner. My, we've had a terrible lot of funerals in our family." "I suppose every old family has," said Anne, because Miss Valentine evidently expected her to say something. "Don't tell me any family has ever had as many as ours," said Miss Valentine jealously. "We're very consumptive. Most of us died of a cough. This is Aunt Bessie's grave. She was a saint if ever there was one. But there's no doubt her sister, Aunt Cecilia, was the most interesting to talk to. The last time I ever saw her, she said to me, 'Sit down, my dear, sit down. I'm going to die tonight at 10 minutes past 11, but that's no reason why we shouldn't have a good gossip for the last.' The strange thing, Miss Shirley, is that she did die that night at 10 minutes past 11. Can you tell me how she knew it?" Anne couldn't. "My great-great-grandfather Cordelow is buried here. He came out in 1760, and he made spinning wheels for a living. I've heard he made 1,400 in the course of his life. When he died, the minister preached from the text, 'Their works do follow them.' And old Myron Pringle said, in that case, then the road to heaven behind my great-great-grandfather would be choked with spinning wheels. Do you think such a remark was in good taste, Miss Shirley?" Had anyone but a Pringle said it, Anne might not have remarked so decidedly. "I certainly do not," looking at a gravestone adorned with a skull and crossbones, as if she questioned the good taste of that also. "My cousin Dora is buried here. She had 3 husbands, but they all died very rapidly. Poor Dora didn't seem to have any luck picking a healthy man. Her last one was Benjamin Banning, not buried here, buried in Lowvale beside his first wife, and he wasn't reconciled to dying. Dora told him he was going to a better world. 'Maybe, maybe,' says poor old Ben, 'but I'm sort of used to the imperfections of this one.' He took 61 different kinds of medicine, but in spite of that, he lingered for a good while. Uncle David Cordelow's family are here. There's a cabbage rose planted at the foot of every grave, and my, don't they bloom. I come here every summer and gather them for my rose jar. It would be a pity to let them go to waste, don't you think?" I suppose so." "My poor young sister Harriet lies here," sighed Miss Valentine. "She had magnificent hair, about the color of yours, not so red, perhaps. It reached to her knees. She was engaged when she died. They tell me you're engaged. I never much wanted to be married, but I think it would have been nice to be engaged. Oh, I've had some chances, of course. Perhaps I was too fastidious. But a Cordelow couldn't marry everybody, could she? It did not seem likely she could. Frank Digby, over in that corner under the sumacs, wanted me. I did feel a little regretful over refusing him. But a Digby, my dear! He married Georgina Troop. She always went to church a little late to show off her clothes. My, she was fond of clothes. She was buried in such a pretty blue dress. I made it for her to wear to a wedding, but in the end she wore it to her own funeral. She had 3 darling little children. They used to sit in front of me at church, and I always gave them candy. Do you think it wrong to give children candy in church, Miss Shirley? Not peppermints. That would be all right. There's something religious about peppermints, don't you think? But the poor things don't like them. When Miss Cordelow's plots were exhausted, Miss Valentine's reminiscence became spicier. It did not make so much difference if you weren't a Cordelow. Old Mrs. Russell Pringle is here. I often wonder if she's in heaven or not. But why? Gasped Anne, rather shocked. Well, she always hated her sister, Mary Ann, who had died a few months before. If Mary Ann is in heaven, I won't stay there, says she. And she was a woman who always kept her word, my dear. Pringle-like. She was born a Pringle and married her cousin Russell. This is Mrs. Dan Pringle, Janetta Bird, 72 a day when she died. Folks said she would have thought it wrong to die a day older than 70 because that is the Bible limit. People do say such funny things, don't they? I've heard that dying was the only thing she dared to do without asking her husband. Do you know, my dear, what he did once when she bought a hat he didn't like? I can't imagine. He ate it, said Miss Valentine solemnly. Of course, it was only a small hat, lace and flowers, no feathers. Still, it must have been rather indigestible. I understand he had gnawing pains in his stomach for quite a time. Of course, I didn't see him eat it, but I've always been assured the story was true. Do you suppose it was? I'd believe anything of a Pringle, said Anne bitterly. Miss Valentine pressed her arm sympathetically. I feel for you. Indeed I do. It's terrible the way they're treating you. But Summerside isn't all Pringle, Miss Shirley. Sometimes I think it is, said Anne with a rueful smile. No, it isn't. And there are plenty of people would like to see you get the better of them. Don't you give in to them no matter what they do. It's just the old Satan that's got into them. But they hang together so, and Miss Sarah did want that cousin of theirs to get the school. The Nathan Pringles are here. Nathan always believed his wife was trying to poison him, but he didn't seem to mind. He said it made life kind of exciting. Once, he kind of suspected she'd put arsenic in his porridge. He went out and fed it to the pig. The pig died 3 weeks afterwards, but he said maybe it was only a coincidence, and anyway, he couldn't be sure it was the same pig. In the end, she died before him, and he said she'd always been a real good wife to him except for that one thing. I think it would be charitable to believe that he was mistaken about it. Sacred to the memory of Miss Kinsey, read Anne in amazement. What an extraordinary inscription! Had she no other name? If she had, nobody ever knew it, said Miss Valentine. She came from Nova Scotia and worked for the George Pringles for 40 years. She gave her name as Miss Kinsey, and everybody called her that. She died suddenly, and then it was discovered that nobody knew her first name, and she had no relations that anybody could find. So they put that on her stone. The George Pringles buried her very nicely and paid for the monument. She was a faithful, hard-working creature, but if you'd ever seen her, you'd have thought she was born Miss Kinsey. The James Morleys are here. I was at their golden wedding. Such a to-do! Gifts and speeches and flowers, and their children all home and them smiling and bowing, just hating each other as hard as they could. Hating each other? Bitterly, my dear. Everyone knew it. They had for years and years. Almost all their married life, in fact. They quarreled on the way home from church after the wedding. I often wonder how they managed to lie there so peacefully side by side." Again Anne shivered. How terrible! Sitting opposite each other at a table, lying down beside each other at night, going to church with their babies to be christened, and hating each other through it all. Yet they must have loved to begin with. Was it possible she and Gilbert could ever? Nonsense! The Pringles were getting on her nerves. "Handsome John McTabb is buried here. He was always suspected of being the reason why Annetta Kennedy drowned herself. The McTabbs were all handsome, but you could never believe a word they said. There used to be a stone here for his Uncle Samuel, who was reported drowned at sea 50 years ago. When he turned up alive, the family took the stone down. The man they bought it from wouldn't take it back, so Mrs. Samuel used it for a baking board. Talk about a marble slab for mixing on. That old tombstone was just fine, she said. The McTabb children were always bringing cookies to school with raised letters and figures on them, scraps of the epitaph. They gave them away real generous, but I never could bring myself to eat one. I'm peculiar that way. Mr. Harley Pringle is here. He had to wheel Peter McTabb down Main Street once in a wheelbarrow, wearing a bonnet for an election bet. All Summerside turned out to see it, except the Pringles, of course. They nearly died of shame. Millie Pringle is here. I was very fond of Millie, even if she was a Pringle. She was so pretty and as light-footed as a fairy. Sometimes I think, my dear, on nights like this, she must slip out of her grave and dance like she used to do. But I suppose a Christian shouldn't be harboring such thoughts. This is Herb Pringle's grave. He was one of the jolly Pringles. He always made you laugh. He laughed right out in church once, when the mouse dropped out of the flowers on Meta Pringle's hat when she bowed in prayer. I didn't feel much like laughing. I didn't know where the mouse had gone. I pulled my skirts tight about my ankles and held them there till church was out. But it spoiled the sermon for me. Herb sat behind me, and such a shout as he gave. People who couldn't see the mouse thought he'd gone crazy. It seemed to me that the laugh of his couldn't die. It seemed to me that laugh of his couldn't die. If he was alive, he'd stand up for you, Sarah or no Sarah. This, of course, is Captain Abraham Pringle's monument. It dominated the whole graveyard. 4 receding platforms of stone formed a square pedestal on which rose a huge pillar of marble, topped with a ridiculous draped urn beneath which a fat cherub was blowing a horn. "How ugly," said Anne candidly. "Oh, do you think so?" Miss Valentine seemed rather shocked. "It was thought very handsome when it was erected. That is supposed to be Gabriel blowing his trumpet. I think it gives quite a touch of elegance to the graveyard. It cost $900. Captain Abraham was a fine old man. It's a great pity he's dead. If he was living, they wouldn't be persecuting you the way they are. I don't wonder Sarah and Ellen are proud of him, though I think they carry it a bit too far." At the graveyard gate, Anne turned and looked back. A strange, peaceful hush lay over the windless land. Long fingers of moonlight were beginning to pierce the darkling firs, touching a gravestone here and there and making strange shadows among them. But the graveyard wasn't a sad place after all. Really, the people in it seemed alive after Miss Valentine's tales. "I've heard you right," said Miss Valentine anxiously as they went down the lane. "You won't put the things I've told you in your stories, will you?" "You may be sure I won't," promised Anne. "Do you think it's really wrong or dangerous to speak ill of the dead?" whispered Miss Valentine a bit anxiously. "I don't suppose it's exactly either," said Anne. "Only rather unfair, like hitting those who can't defend themselves. But you didn't say anything very dreadful of anybody, Miss Cordelow." "I told you Nathan Pringle thought his wife was trying to poison him." "But you give her the benefit of the doubt." And Miss Valentine went away reassured.